In the heart of Texas, a young life was cut tragically short in a case that shook an entire community. The story of 5-year-old Mercedes Losoya and the horrific abuse she endured at the hands of those who should have protected her is one of betrayal, pain, and the pursuit of justice. Join us as we uncover the chilling details behind this heartbreaking case and the fight to ensure her voice is never forgotten.
In early February 2022, San Antonio, Texas, was shaken by the tragic death of 5-year-old Mercedes Losoya. On February 7th, her mother, 22-year-old Katrina Mendoza, rushed her unresponsive daughter to Southwest General Hospital. Medical personnel were horrified to discover Mercedes covered in bruises, cuts, and missing patches of hair, clear indicators of severe abuse. Despite the medical team's efforts, Mercedes was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The Bexar County Medical Examiner's Office conducted an autopsy, revealing extensive injuries consistent with prolonged torture. The sheer number of wounds made it impossible to pinpoint a singular cause of death. Investigators quickly turned their attention to Mercedes' immediate family. Mendoza's boyfriend, 27-year-old Jose Angel Ruiz, became a primary suspect due to his close proximity to the child. Both Mendoza and Ruiz were arrested and charged with injury to a child causing serious bodily injury. During police interviews, Mendoza alleged that Ruiz had subjected Mercedes to horrific abuse. She claimed he forced the child to ingest dog feces and stuffed a urine-soaked sock into her mouth, actions that left Mercedes missing to teeth. Mendoza admitted to witnessing these acts but failed to intervene. Ruiz, on the other hand, denied the allegations, asserting that Mendoza was responsible for the abuse. He admitted to disciplining Mercedes but insisted his actions were not severe. The conflicting accounts complicated the investigation, prompting authorities to delve deeper into the couple's history. Family members revealed that Mercedes often had visible injuries, raising concerns about ongoing abuse. Child Protective Services had previously investigated Mendoza for neglect and abuse, but the children remained in her care. This oversight would later come under scrutiny. As the community mourned Mercedes' death, questions arose about the system's failure to protect her. Vigils were held, and advocates called for reforms in child protective services to prevent such tragedies in the future. The media coverage intensified, shedding light on the harrowing details of Mercedes' short life. Public outrage grew, demanding justice for the innocent child whose suffering went unnoticed for too long. Authorities faced immense pressure to ensure that those responsible were held accountable. The case became a focal point for discussions on child abuse and the responsibilities of caregivers and the community. As the legal proceedings began, both Mendoza and Ruiz awaited their fate. The community hoped for a verdict that would honor Mercedes' memory and serve as a deterrent against future acts of child abuse. The stage was set for a complex trial, with both defendants pointing fingers at each other. The truth behind Mercedes' suffering remained entangled in a web of accusations and denials. In August 2023, Mendoza accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to injury to a child causing serious bodily injury by omission. The agreement capped her sentence at 45 years and required her to testify against Ruiz. This development marked a significant turn in the pursuit of justice for Mercedes. During Ruiz's trial in March 2024, Mendoza took the stand, providing chilling testimony about the abuse Mercedes endured. She described how Ruiz would mop the floor with Mercedes after she wet herself, dragging her across the floor in her own urine. These revelations painted a horrifying picture of the child's suffering. Mendoza also recounted instances where Ruiz beat Mercedes with a belt, pulled out her hair, and suffocated her until she lost consciousness. She admitted to allowing Ruiz to discipline her daughter, believing his methods were appropriate. This admission highlighted her complicity in the abuse. The prosecution presented graphic evidence extracted from Ruiz's cell phone, including photos and videos of Mercedes' injuries. One image showed the child standing in a shower with clothes stuffed in her mouth, underscoring the extent of her torment. Ruiz's defense attempted to shift blame onto Mendoza, citing extensive Child Protective Services reports documenting her abusive behavior. They argued that Mendoza was the primary abuser, and Ruiz was unaware of the severity of the situation. However, testimonies from family members contradicted this narrative. They revealed that Mendoza often referred to Mercedes as the bad child and complained about her behavior, suggesting a pattern of scapegoating. The trial also highlighted systemic failures. Child Protective Services had investigated the family multiple times but failed to remove the children from Mendoza's care. This negligence allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. Witnesses testified that Mercedes' injuries were evident long before her death. Neighbors and relatives noticed bruises and other signs of abuse but felt powerless to intervene effectively. The community grappled with collective guilt, questioning how such atrocities could occur unnoticed. Public forums and discussions emphasized the need for vigilance and proactive measures to protect vulnerable children. As the trial progressed, the jury was confronted with overwhelming evidence of Ruiz's involvement in the abuse. The testimonies and visual evidence left an indelible mark on all present. The proceedings served as a grim reminder of the horrors of child abuse and the importance of community responsibility. Mercedes' story became a catalyst for change, inspiring initiatives aimed at safeguarding children. On March 18, 2024, the jury found Jose Ruiz guilty on all charges related to Mercedes' death. He was sentenced to life in prison, a decision that brought a semblance of justice to a grieving community. Following Ruiz's conviction, Mendoza faced her sentencing. On April 29, 2024, Judge Stephanie Boyd sentenced her to 45 years in prison, the maximum allowed under her plea agreement. The judge emphasized the gravity of Mendoza's neglect and complicity. During sentencing, Mendoza's defense attorney argued for probation, citing her need for psychological help.
We're going deep today on the case of Mercedes Losoya, 5 years old, from San Antonio.
Yeah.
Tragic story.
Absolutely.
And one that I think, grabbed a lot of headlines a couple years ago.
Yeah, and from the looks of the stack of articles and court documents you sent my way, it seems like one you really want to get to the bottom of.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people felt like the news coverage just, wasn't enough. They wanted more. They wanted to know what went on. So.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that stays with you,
Yeah.
What happened to this little girl is just, it's tough to even talk about. But I think you're right. There's a lot more to it than just the headlines and the sort of surface level details.
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting is how this goes beyond, just one terrible thing that happened, right?
Yeah.
It's about the whole system that's supposed to protect kids.
Yeah.
The choices people made, how all of that, came together to create this really terrible outcome.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this case so compelling, but so disturbing too. It forces us to look at ourselves as a society and ask some hard questions about how we protect our most vulnerable members.
So let's start at the beginning. February 2022, little Mercedes is rushed to the hospital.
Right.
And the sources paint a really, really grim picture.
It's one of the most difficult aspects of this deep dive.
Yeah.
Reading through the hospital records. What struck me was the sheer shock of the medical personnel who saw her.
Right.
This wasn't a case of like a broken arm or, a single injury that needed explaining.
Yeah.
This little girl was unresponsive. Her entire body was covered in bruises, cuts, missing patches of hair.
Oh my God.
Even her teeth weren't all there.
That's just an image that's hard to shake, you know?
Yeah, it's incredibly disturbing. And it was immediately clear to the medical staff that this was a case of severe abuse.
So then comes the autopsy report, and I imagine that's where the real horror of what Mercedes endured comes into focus.
It's one of the most difficult aspects of this deep dive.
Yeah.
The report doesn't just list injuries, it chronicles this prolonged suffering.
Right.
Bruises of different ages, internal injuries. The sheer extent of the damage was so severe that the medical examiner couldn't even pinpoint a single cause of death.
Oh, wow.
This poor child, she was 5 years old and her life was just pain.
It's just heartbreaking, and it makes you wonder, how could something like this go on without anyone stepping in?
Right.
But before we get to that, we have two adults in the picture. Mercedes' mother, Katrina Mendoza, and her boyfriend, Jose Angel Ruiz.
Right.
And their initial statements to the police, it's almost like something out of a crime drama.
Yeah.
Two completely different stories.
Classic he said, she said, but with horrifying twist.
Yeah.
Mendoza claims that Ruiz was the monster, describing these acts of cruelty that are almost impossible to even comprehend.
Like what?
She claims he forced Mercedes to eat dog feces, shoved a urine-soaked sock in her mouth, and the most disturbing part is she admits to witnessing this happening.
That's what gets me. How does a mother, even one under duress, even if she's scared herself, how can she see that happening to her child and not?
It's a question that haunts this entire case.
Yeah.
And it forces us to consider something called trauma bonding.
Okay.
This complex psychological phenomenon, often seen in domestic violence situations where the victim becomes emotionally dependent on the abuser.
Right.
It's not a simple case of good versus evil here. It's a warped sense of survival where the lines get blurred.
So Mendoza's pointing the finger at Ruiz, but where does that leave him in his own defense?
Ruiz doesn't deny disciplining Mercedes,
Yeah.
but he downplays the severity, claiming it was just normal parental correction.
Okay.
And of course, he accuses Mendoza of being the primary abuser.
Right, so it's just shifting the blame.
Exactly. And what's interesting here is that this isn't just a legal tactic. It plays into this deeper societal issue where there's often a reluctance to believe that men can be capable of such brutality towards children, especially when there's already a woman involved in the case.
Yeah, it's almost like people want to believe that a mother would be the one to protect her child from that, and so they immediately assume that it was her.
It's a dangerous assumption, and in this case, it seems like it might have contributed to the tragedy.
So we have these two narratives clashing, but even with their conflicting stories, there must have been red flags popping up long before February 2022 that should have raised some serious concerns.
Absolutely, and that's where the cracks in the system become painfully apparent.
Okay, so what are we talking about here?
We have documented evidence that Child Protective Services CPS had investigated Mendoza multiple times.
Wow, so they were already on their radar.
Yes, there were reports from neighbors, even relative, about Mercedes showing up with visible injuries.
So it's like a checklist of missed opportunities.
Right.
Someone saw something, reported it, but then what went wrong?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
There are limitations to how CPS operates. It's incredibly difficult to prove abuse without overwhelming evidence, and often that evidence only comes to light after a tragedy like this.
So it's a reactive system.
Exactly. And in Mercedes's case, it reacted too late.
It's just so frustrating to think about, all these people who could have maybe done something.
And that's the thing. It's not just about CPS.
Right.
This also points to the bystander effect, people noticing things, but not intervening decisively.
Right, like not wanting to get involved or thinking someone else will handle it.
Exactly. Maybe they didn't want to get involved. Maybe they didn't know the proper channels to report their concerns, or maybe they just didn't want to believe that something so horrific could be happening.
Right.
It's a societal blind spot that tragically contributed to Mercedes's fate.
And that blind spot, that lack of action, that's what fueled the public outrage, right? This wasn't just a family matter anymore. It became a community's cry for justice.
Absolutely. The sources you provided paint a vivid picture of the vigils, the protests, the calls for reform that echoed throughout San Antonio after Mercedes's death.
Yeah, it's like the whole city was just in mourning and demanding answers.
Mercedes's death became a symbol, a rallying point for a community demanding better protection for their most vulnerable members.
Right. And in a way that public outcry is a form of intervention, but one that sadly happened after the fact.
That's the frustrating reality. Awareness often comes at a terrible price.
Yeah.
But we can't ignore that public pressure is often what forces change.
Right. And that's why we're talking about this right now.
Exactly. Mercedes's story, while heartbreaking, became a catalyst for a conversation that needed to happen. A conversation about how we as a society can do better to protect our children.
So let's go back to the courtroom. Mendoza eventually strikes a plea deal.
Right.
What did that entail, and what does it tell us about the legal strategy at play?
This is where things get ethically murky.
Okay.
Mendoza pleads guilty to injury to a child causing serious bodily injury by omission.
By omission.
That phrase, by omission, is crucial. It acknowledges that she wasn't the direct abuser, but failed to protect Mercedes from harm.
Right. So she's admitting to some level of responsibility, but not taking the full blame.
Exactly. Her sentence is capped at 45 years, but the catch is she has to testify against Ruiz.
So it's a trade-off. They get her testimony, but potentially give leniency to someone who's also responsible for Mercedes' suffering.
It's a gamble on the prosecution's part. They need her testimony to secure a conviction against Ruiz, but they're potentially giving a lighter sentence to someone who's complicit in the abuse.
So that must have been a really tough call for them.
These deals are always controversial. They raise questions about the very nature of justice.
Right. Like, what is true justice in a case like this?
Is it about punishment, about deterring future crimes, or about uncovering the full truth no matter how messy it gets?
Yeah, you're weighing so many different factors.
And in this case, the prosecution decided that getting a conviction against Ruiz was worth the risk of potentially giving Mendoza a lighter sentence.
And with that plea deal in place, the stage is set for Ruiz's trial, and that's where I imagine the true horror of Mercedes' final months comes into sharp focus.
Indeed. And it's primarily through Mendoza's testimony that we get this horrifyingly detailed picture of the abuse she endured. But before we dive into that, let's take a moment to recognize the weight of what we're discussing.
Yeah.
This isn't just a story. It's a little girl's life that was tragically cut short.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the legal back and forth, but we can't lose sight of the human cost. So let's take a breath and come back to Ruiz's trial and Mendoza's testimony in part 2.
All right, we're back. And before we get into Mendoza's testimony, I'm just curious from your perspective, having looked at so many of these cases, what's your take on using a perpetrator's accomplice, someone who was part of the problem as the key witness?
It's a tricky situation for sure. I mean, on the one hand, you have someone who was there who can provide those firsthand details that no one else can. But there's always that question of reliability. Can their testimony be fully trusted? Are they downplaying their own role to get a lighter sentence, exaggerating the other person's actions, and adds this whole other layer of complexity for the jury to consider. For sure. And in this case, the jury had to listen to Mendoza recount these events that are just unimaginable. For most of us, it must have been absolutely gut-wrenching.
Absolutely. The court transcripts are difficult to read. Even for someone like me who's been studying these cases for years, it's like something out of a horror movie. But this was real life for Mercedes.
It's hard to even fathom.
Mendoza describes Ruiz dragging her across the floor by her hair after she had an accident, calling it mopping the floor.
Oh my God.
It's such a chilling image, and it speaks to this level of cruelty that goes way beyond discipline.
Yeah, and that's what's so disturbing about this case. It's trying to figure out where's the line between discipline, even if it's harsh, and outright torture.
Right, and that's where the psychological aspect becomes so important. It's not just about the physical acts. It's about the power dynamics, the control, the dehumanization.
Right.
Ruiz's actions weren't about teaching Mercedes right from wrong. They were about breaking her spirit, and it didn't stop there. Mendoza's testimony goes on to detail beatings with a belt, hair pulling, even suffocation.
It's just horrific. And as you're listening to this testimony, are you thinking, okay, was this a sudden escalation, or were there signs that this level of abuse had been happening earlier?
That's a key question for investigators, and it's one that the defense tries to exploit.
How so?
They point to those earlier CPS reports, focusing on incidents where Mendoza was allegedly the primary abuser. They try to build this narrative that Ruiz was unaware of the escalating severity, that he was maybe a strict disciplinarian, but not this monster who was intentionally torturing Mercedes.
So it becomes this battle of narratives, but beyond the he said, she said, the prosecution had something else that really worked in their favor, Ruiz's own cell phone.
Right, and this is where the case really takes a turn.
Yeah, tell me about this.
Remember those photos we talked about from the sources you provided?
Yeah, the ones that were so disturbing.
Right? Those were taken from Ruiz's phone images of Mercedes' injuries, almost like trophies documenting the abuse. And then there's that one photo of Mercedes in the shower with clothes stuffed in her mouth. It's just impossible to view that as anything other than calculated cruelty.
It's chilling. And, for me, that one image is more damning than any testimony. It speaks to this level of premeditation, a desire to not just inflict pain, but to humiliate and silence.
Absolutely. And that's what the prosecution hammers home. They argue that Ruiz's actions were intentional, that he was in control, that he chose to escalate the abuse even as Mercedes grew weaker.
So given the weight of that evidence, Mendoza's testimony, the photos from Ruiz's phone, it seems like an open and shut case. Was the defense able to counter that narrative at all?
They cast doubt on Mendoza's credibility, claiming she's lying to save herself. They paint her as the unstable one, the real abuser, and Ruiz as this sort of misled bystander who is just trying to help.
Right, playing into that societal perception we talked about earlier.
Exactly, but ultimately it's a losing battle. The evidence against Ruiz is just too overwhelming.
And that brings us back to that question that haunts this entire case. Could this tragedy have been prevented?
It's the question that keeps coming up, isn't it?
Yeah.
Knowing what we know now about the CPS investigations, the reports from neighbors and family, where were the points of intervention that were missed?
Where were the cracks in the system?
It's easy to point fingers after the fact, but it's important to understand the limitations of the system. CPS is often overwhelmed, understaffed, and reliant on clear evidence, which can be difficult to obtain in cases of child abuse.
Yeah, and proving neglect is a lot harder than proving physical abuse.
Exactly, and sometimes those signs are subtle or hidden from view.
But there's also the human element, the people who saw Mercedes with bruises, who heard the yelling, who maybe suspected something wasn't right, but didn't act decisively.
We talked about the bystander effect earlier, and it's a powerful force. People hesitate to get involved. They're afraid of making false accusations. They think someone else will handle it.
It's that diffusion of responsibility.
Exactly. And unfortunately, in Mercedes' case, that collective inaction had devastating consequences.
So what can we learn from this? What needs to change to make sure a tragedy like this doesn't happen again?
That's the question that lingers long after the verdicts are read and the sentences are handed down. And I think the answer lies in a multifaceted approach.
What do you mean by that? Break it down for us.
Well, on a systemic level, we need to strengthen our child protection agencies, more funding for CPS, better training for caseworkers, clearer protocols for handling reports of abuse.
So making sure they have the resources and the support to do their jobs effectively.
Exactly. But it's also about empowering individuals to act. We need to educate ourselves about the signs of child abuse, to understand our legal obligations as mandated reporters, to know how and when to intervene.
Right, so it's about creating a culture where child protection is everyone's responsibility, not just the job of a government agency.
Exactly. It takes a village to protect a child.
It really does. And even with those systemic changes and increased awareness, there's still that human factor, the choices that people make within their own families behind closed doors. How do we address that?
That's where prevention efforts come in. We need to invest in programs that support families, that provide resources and education on healthy parenting, that teach conflict resolution and anger management skills. We need to create communities where families feel supported, where they can access help before they reach a breaking point.
So it's about building a safety net, both on a societal level and within our own neighborhoods.
Precisely. And it's about shifting our mindset. We need to stop viewing child abuse as someone else's problem. It's a societal issue that requires a collective response, a commitment from all of us to protect the most vulnerable members of our community.
That's a powerful message, and it leads us to the inevitable question, what was the outcome of the trial? Was justice served for Mercedes?
After a harrowing trial with Mendoza's testimony and that cell phone evidence front and center, The jury found Jose Angel Ruiz guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison. Katrina Mendoza, under her plea deal, received 45 years, the maximum allowed.
So legally there was accountability, but I imagine for those who loved Mercedes, for the community that rallied around her memory, it's hard to measure justice in years behind bars.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to the emotional core of this deep dive. While we've explored the systemic failures, the legal battles, the psychological complexities, we can't forget that at the heart of this story is a little girl whose life was tragically cut short.
You're right. And before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, let's take a moment to acknowledge that. We've been through a lot with this case, the legal stuff, the systemic issues, even the psychology of abuse. It's heavy stuff. And, you sent all this in because you really want to understand what happened to Mercedes. So let's talk about what came after the verdicts. What happened once the spotlight moved on.
Yeah, that's a really important part of the story, because this wasn't just another, crime story in San Antonio. Mercedes' death really sparked outrage and this demand for change that went way beyond just punishing the people involved.
Yeah, you have this whole community trying to process this horrible thing that happened, and they're realizing that this little girl was let down by so many people, by the systems that were supposed to protect her. So how did all that grief and anger turn into action?
Well, there was a big push in the Texas legislature to make those child protection laws a lot stronger.
Okay, so more than just talk, like actual changes.
Yeah, they passed several bills specifically because of this case, aimed at preventing something like this from happening again.
So what did those bills actually do? Like, what were the real outcomes?
One of the biggest changes was they finally created a child abuse registry in Texas.
Oh, wow. So like a database.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So law enforcement and child protection agencies can keep track of people who have been convicted of these crimes, makes it a lot harder for them to slip through the cracks.
It seems so obvious. Why didn't they have that before?
These things are always complicated. There are concerns about due process false accusations, protecting the rights of the accused, even in these situations.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But Mercedes' case was so horrific, and the public outcry was so strong, that lawmakers really felt like the need to prevent future tragedies outweighed those concerns.
So besides the registry, did anything change on the resource side? We talked earlier about CPS being overwhelmed, underfunded. Did they get any more support?
They did, actually. The legislature approved a significant funding increase for CPS so they could hire more caseworkers, give them better training, and hopefully respond more effectively to reports of abuse.
That's got to help at least a little.
It does. But, whether it's enough is a whole other question.
Yeah.
It's definitely a step in the right direction, though.
Right. It's that ripple effect. One terrible thing happens, and if people are willing to learn from it, it can actually change how the whole system works. But, laws and funding, that's only part of it. What about the community itself? Did Mercedes' death lead to any, grassroots efforts?
Absolutely. Nonprofit organizations that work on child abuse prevention. They saw this huge increase in donations and volunteers.
Oh, wow. So people were putting their money and their time where their mouth was?
Exactly. There were tons of awareness campaigns, community forums. People really wanted to learn about the warning signs, be more vigilant, break the silence that often surrounds abuse.
Because that whole idea of it takes a village, right?
Exactly. Child protection isn't just the responsibility of social workers or the police. It's up to all of us to look out for each other, especially the kids.
So for our listener who's obviously been following this case really closely, what would you say are the key takeaways from all of this?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that knowledge is power.
Okay.
Understanding the signs of abuse, knowing how to report it, being that person who doesn't look away, those are things that anyone can do.
Right. So it's not about being a hero. It's about being aware.
Exactly. And if this case has affected you, if it's made you want to do something, support the organizations that are doing the work on the ground.
Right.
Whether it's donating, volunteering, or just spreading awareness, those things really do make a difference.
And I think the hardest part maybe is to not let Mercedes' story fade away. Let it be a reminder to be empathetic, to be willing to speak up when something doesn't feel right.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. We've gone deep into some really dark stuff here, but we have to come out of this with a sense of purpose, a commitment to making the world safer for kids.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for walking us through all of this really tough material. I know it's not easy.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And to our listener, thank you for spending this time with us, learning, reflecting, and hopefully feeling empowered to actually do something to make a difference, because that's what the deep dive is all about.